The ground was frozen the morning I buried my son. Not the kind of cold you dress for, the kind that moves inside you and decides to stay. I stood at that graveside in Charlotte, January, wrapping itself around every person who had come to say goodbye to Kendall Wynn. And I felt something shift permanently inside my chest, like a door closing in a room I would never enter again. My name is Geneva Wynn. I am a mother who just put her only child in the ground at 34 years old. And I need you to stay with me, because this story does not go where you think it goes. The ending belongs to Kendall as much as it belongs to me. Before you keep watching, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? The church was full. Kendall had built something real with his life, and the people who knew that showed up. I moved through the service the way you move through deep water. Everything slower, everything heavier, sound arriving slightly after it should. I sang when they sang. I stood when they stood. I held myself together the way my son would have wanted me to. Tiana sat in the front row in black that fit her perfectly. When people came to her, she received them like someone who had rehearsed receiving them. The tears came at the right moments. The tremor in her voice landed exactly where it needed to land. She held Caleb against her side, 6 years old, confused, too young to carry what the adults around him were carrying. And every person who passed her whispered something and touched her arm and looked at her the way people look at a woman they have already decided is the victim of this story. I watched all of it. I said nothing about what I was watching. At the repast, people kept finding me to say the same thing in different arrangements of the same words. That Kendall was gone too soon. That I needed to lean on Tiana now. That we had each other. I smiled and thanked every single one of them and kept my stillness exactly where it was. Locked down. Quiet. Undisturbed. Then Tiana found me near the kitchen doorway and pulled me gently aside. Her hand was warm on my arm. Her eyes were wet. She said she had been thinking about what came next, about Caleb, about Vantage Shield, about making sure Kendall's legacy was protected the right way. She said she didn't want me to carry that alone. I looked at her while she spoke. I watched her eyes. And underneath everything she was performing, underneath the grief and the warmth and the careful words, something else moved. Something that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with calculation. I told her we would talk soon. I held her hand for a moment. I walked back into the room. Near the end of the evening, I noticed a woman I had never seen before standing toward the back. She wasn't speaking to anyone, wasn't eating, wasn't moving toward the family. She was dressed appropriately, composed, holding herself slightly apart from everything happening around her, like someone who had come because she needed to see something with her own eyes, but hadn't decided yet what to do with what she saw. By the time I worked my way across the room, she was gone. I didn't know her name. I filed her face away in the place where you put things you can't explain yet. Later that night, I watched Tiana laugh softly at something someone said. A real laugh. Small and brief, but real. At my son's repast. I felt something settle into me then. Not anger. Not grief. Something quieter and heavier than both. The patience Kendall had asked me to hold on to. It dropped into me like a stone into still water, and it did not move again. I buried my son on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Tiana had already made a phone call to an attorney. I know because I saw the name on her phone when she set it face up on my kitchen counter 2 days later. She didn't notice me noticing. That was her first mistake. There is a specific texture to watching a lie performed with excellence. It does not feel like deception. It feels like devotion. It looks like love until you have held enough real love in your hands to know the difference by weight. Tiana showed up at my door 3 days after the funeral with food containers stacked to her chin and Caleb on her hip. She came the day after that. And the day after that. She called every morning before 9. She inserted herself into every conversation about Kendall's affairs, the house, the accounts, the business, always gently, always framed as concern, always with his name in her mouth like she was the one protecting it. The family received her completely, his cousins, his friends from college, his church members who had watched him grow up. They pulled her in and held her there and told her Kendall would be proud of how she was holding up. She accepted every word with exactly the right amount of humility. Not too much, not too little, just enough to make you believe it cost her something to receive. I watched all of it, and I gave her nothing to read. I was warm. I was tired. I was grateful in all the ways a grieving mother is supposed to be grateful. When she brought food, I thanked her. When she called, I answered. When she sat beside me on my sofa and held my hand, I let her hold it. I felt her measuring me every single time. By the second week after the funeral, conversations about Vantage Shield had become unavoidable. Clients were checking in. Employees needed direction. Attorneys were coordinating estate matters. Kendall's death had left a space that other people were already trying to navigate. It was during one of those conversations that Tiana brought the company up directly. We were sitting at my kitchen table, coffee between us, and she said she had been thinking about the company, that she wanted to make sure Kendall's work wasn't disrupted, that she felt a responsibility to stay involved. Then she said she thought it might help if she had access to certain company accounts, just to monitor things, just to make sure nothing fell through the cracks during the transition. I looked at her over my coffee cup. I told her I would speak to the attorney. She smiled and said she understood completely. That evening, I sat alone in my kitchen and a memory surfaced that I had not thought about in 7 months. Tiana had been at my house for Sunday dinner and had stepped into the hallway to take a phone call. I had passed the hallway on my way to the kitchen and caught only a few seconds of her voice, low, unhurried, certain. She was saying, "It just needs more time. We're almost there." I had thought nothing of it then. A work call, a conversation with a friend, something ordinary. I thought everything of it now. Because the woman sitting across from me at my kitchen table with her careful questions and her warm hands was not a widow trying to survive her grief. She was a woman who had been moving towards something long before Kendall was in the ground. Long before he got sick. Long before any of this had a name I could speak out loud. The patience she was performing for everyone around her, I recognized it now because I had heard it in her voice 7 months ago in my own hallway. She had been patient far longer than I knew. Something shifted in me that evening. Not loudly, not with any visible change. It moved the way cold moves, quietly, completely, until it had replaced everything that was there before. I was done grieving in the direction of what I had lost. I was starting to look in a different direction entirely. The next morning, I called Kendall's attorney's office to confirm I would not be granting Tiana access to any company accounts. The paralegal paused. Then she said, carefully, that she was a little surprised to hear that, because Tiana had called earlier that same morning asking for exactly that access, and had told them I had already agreed. Kendall kept his office the way he kept everything, with a specific, deliberate order that had its own logic if you knew how to read him. Books arranged by subject, not alphabetically. Cables coiled and labeled. The surface of his desk clear except for one framed photograph. The two of us at Vantage Shield's first client signing, him in a blue shirt, me trying not to cry. And a coffee mug he never threw away because I gave it to him the Christmas he launched the company. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I walked in. The room smelled like him. That specific combination of cedar and something clean that I have never been able to name. I had not been inside since before he died, and the smell of him hit me somewhere below words, below thought. I stood there and breathed it, and then I moved, because I had not come here to fall apart. I had come because Tiana had a key to this house, and I was not going to let her walk through this room before I did. I went through things carefully, personal items, documents, anything that needed to be somewhere safe before the estate process formalized. I moved through the space the way you move when you are trying to hold yourself together by staying useful. It was the middle desk drawer that stopped me. I had pulled it open looking for a specific folder, and my hand caught the underside of the drawer. Something taped there, flat against the wood. A small envelope. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Kendall had always hidden things that way. Not important things. Birthday cards. Notes. Little reminders tucked into places he knew I would eventually find. It was one of those habits that made perfect sense only if you knew him. Inside the envelope was a folded note in Kendall's handwriting. 4 words and a date. Wait for the meeting. I sat down in his chair. I do not know how long I sat there. Long enough for the room to go quiet around me in a different way. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet of presence. Kendall had taped that note to the underside of that drawer, knowing I would be the one to find it. Knowing I would come here before anyone else. Knowing I would need something to hold on to that was his voice, not his memory. He had been here, in this chair, and he had thought of me, and he had left me instructions. I folded the note and put it in my pocket. Then I heard the front door. Tiana's voice moved through the house calling my name, warm, unhurried, as though she had every right to be there, which technically she did. I closed the drawer, straightened the items on the desk, and walked out of the office, pulling the door behind me just as she appeared at the end of the hallway. She said she had been trying to reach me. She had Caleb with her, his hand in hers, his eyes moving around the house with the particular uncertainty of a child, in a space that used to mean something safe. I felt the sight of him in my chest and kept my face entirely still. Tiana said she had been thinking about moving back in, that it would be good for Caleb to have somewhere familiar while things got settled. She said it softly, framed around him, her eyes steady on mine. I watched those eyes while she spoke. She was not talking about Caleb's comfort. She was talking about this house, these rooms, whatever Kendall might have left inside them. She had come here for the same reason I had. I told her the house had already been formally secured as part of the estate, that I had called the attorney that morning before I came, and the property couldn't be accessed or occupied by anyone until after the estate meeting. The decision was already made. The door was already closed. Something moved across her face. Small, controlled, gone in under a second. She said she understood completely. She picked up Caleb and she left. I stood at the window and watched her car until it turned the corner. My hand was in my pocket, 4 words pressed against my palm. I was not afraid of the estate meeting anymore. I was waiting for it. Nobody prepares you for the specific indignity of being served legal papers. It is not the words inside them. It is the stranger at your door, the clipboard, the flat professional courtesy of someone handing you a document that has already decided what your life is worth and is simply informing you of the conclusion. I signed for it. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment, holding an envelope addressed to me in connection with my dead son's company. Then I went to the kitchen, put the envelope on the table, and made coffee. I read every page twice before I touched the coffee. Tiana's legal team had filed a formal claim against Vantage Shield. The filing argued that as Kendall's widow and Caleb's legal guardian, Tiana was entitled to controlling interest in the company. My 30% stake, the stake I had funded with my retirement savings when my son had nothing but a plan and a rented office, was to be bought out at a figure so far below market value it read less like an offer and more like an instruction. The language was aggressive and precise. This was not a document written in grief. This was a document that had been waiting. I made a second cup of coffee and read it a third time. Not for the emotional impact of it. I had already absorbed that. I was reading it the way Kendall taught me to read anything that came from an adversary. Not for what it said, for what it revealed. And it revealed a great deal. There was an entire section dedicated to Tiana's contributions to Vantage Shield during the marriage, client dinners she had attended, company events where she appeared as Kendall's partner, a marketing advisory role she had apparently held, documented, dated, with her name on internal correspondence. I sat back in my chair. I knew every one of those events. I had been at some of them. I had watched Tiana move through those rooms and thought she was being a supportive wife. I had been grateful she took an interest. I had told Kendall once, early in the marriage, that he had chosen well, that Tiana understood what he was building. She had understood exactly what he was building. Every dinner, every event, every email where she inserted her name into company correspondence. She had not been building a marriage. She had been building a paper trail. And she had been building it while Kendall was alive, while I was sitting across from her at family dinners, while I was calling her daughter and meaning it. This filing did not begin after Kendall died. It began while he was living, while she was sleeping beside him, while she was bringing food to my house and holding my hand and performing everything love is supposed to look like. I sat with that understanding and waited for what it would feel like. I expected anger. I expected the particular burn of betrayal. What arrived instead was something quieter and more clarifying than either of those things. It settled over everything like a light coming on in a dark room. Not rage, not hurt, clarity. Complete, unobstructed clarity about the woman I had been dealing with and the length of time I had been dealing with her without knowing it. I picked up the phone and called Kendall's attorney. He told me the estate meeting had been formally scheduled. He told me I needed to be there in person. I asked him one question, whether the sealed letter was still secure. He said, "It is exactly where Kendall left it." I thanked him and hung up. I looked at the legal papers spread across my kitchen table. All that careful, premeditated language, all that constructed documentation. And I left them exactly where they were. They were not a threat anymore. They were evidence of how little she knew about what was coming. Charlotte looks different when you are carrying something nobody around you can see. The same streets, the same buildings, the same people moving through their ordinary Tuesday, like the world is exactly the size it appears to be. I drove through all of it, holding something invisible and heavy and mine alone. And the city had no idea. The attorney's office was on the 14th floor of a building uptown. Clean lobby, quiet elevator, the particular hush of a place where serious things get decided in calm voices. I had been here once before, with Kendall 2 years ago, for something routine. He had held the door for me and called me his business partner and meant it. I sat across from the attorney now, without him, and kept my hands still in my lap. He walked me through the estate meeting process with the careful thoroughness of a man who understood the weight of what he was managing. Who would be present, how the room would be arranged, the sequence of how the meeting would proceed. He confirmed that both the sealed letter and the sealed secondary file were in his possession exactly as Kendall had deposited them, intact, secured, and held under the specific conditions Kendall had attached to each. The attorney explained that Kendall had been unusually meticulous about how the materials were to be presented. Certain supporting documents attached to the filing remained sealed until the meeting itself, and the secondary file could only be released under the conditions Kendall had specified. I already knew what Kendall had told me the night he sat at my kitchen table. I knew the shape of what that letter carried, but the specific architecture of it, the exact words Kendall chose, the order he assembled things, what supporting materials he chose to reveal and when, that I did not know. That letter was still his voice. I was going to hear it for the first time, the same way the rest of that room would hear it. I asked the attorney one question: whether the letter would be read before or after Tiana's legal team presented their claim. He told me it was not a matter of scheduling preference. Kendall had attached a binding written condition to the estate filing itself. The letter was to be read first, before any other estate matter was introduced or discussed. It was not the attorney's discretion. It was Kendall's legal instruction, filed with the estate and enforceable as part of the administration process. I nodded and said nothing more about it. On my way out, I passed a man in the lobby moving toward the elevator with a leather portfolio under his arm, and the particular bearing of someone arriving for a meeting he considers already won. I recognized him, Tiana's attorney, from the paperwork. He saw me and arranged his face into something sympathetic, gracious, the expression of a man extending courtesy to someone on the losing side. I smiled back warmly and kept walking. In my car in the parking deck, I sat for a moment and let myself think about Kendall building all of this. 34 years old, sitting in offices like that one, making instructions, sealing files, closing every door he could reach. Not knowing precisely how much time he had, but building as though time was already running short, making sure that even if he was not in the room, he would still be speaking. I pulled out of the parking deck and drove back through Charlotte and felt him beside me the entire way, not as grief, not as absence, as something active, as partnership. That evening, my phone rang. Tiana's voice was warm and measured. She said she hoped the legal process wouldn't come between us, that she only wanted to protect Caleb's future. That family was still family no matter what. I listened to every word she said. Then I told her, "I know you do, baby. I'll see you at the meeting." I hung up and sat in the quiet of my house. Yes, you will. There is something I have been carrying since before my son died. I have not said it out loud to anyone since the night Kendall sat across from me and said it himself. I am not discovering any of this. I have known it since that kitchen table. I am finally saying it out loud. It started with a fever. Caleb was 4 years old when it spiked high enough that Tiana took him to the hospital. Kendall met them there. The visit itself was routine, the kind of childhood illness that feels frightening in the moment and ordinary a week later. A few days afterward, while reviewing discharge paperwork and insurance records, Kendall noticed something that would not leave him alone. The records listed Caleb's blood type as AB. Kendall was O positive. Tiana had always said she was A positive. Kendall told me he sat at his desk and checked the genetics 3 different times before allowing himself to believe what he was seeing. He is an engineer. He reads data the way other people read faces. An O positive father and an A positive mother cannot produce an AB child. The biology does not allow it. He understood exactly what the paperwork suggested, and he said nothing, not to Tiana, not to anyone. 3 weeks later, on a morning Tiana was away, he collected a hair sample from Caleb's hairbrush. He sent it with his own sample to a private laboratory, not a hospital, not a court order. A private paternity test legally available to any presumed father. The result came back in 11 days. He included the laboratory report, the chain of custody documentation, and his own signed statement in the sealed letter. He told me it was sufficient to dismantle the foundational claim that Caleb was his heir. Then he hired a private investigator. The photographs came back 6 weeks later. He recognized the man immediately. Someone who had attended Vantage Shield events, who had shaken his hand, who had sat at his table and eaten his food and looked him in the eye. Sterling Mack. I knew that name. I had shaken that man's hand myself. I sat at my kitchen table the night Kendall told me, and I held that name in my mouth and said nothing for a long time. Kendall kept talking. He told me about the secondary sealed file, that he had given his attorney a notarized instruction specifying that the moment the estate meeting was formally scheduled, the attorney was to contact the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department and inform them that a file relevant to a potential criminal matter was available upon their request. The attorney could not hand it over alone, but he could open the door. And the moment that meeting was scheduled, that door would open. Then Kendall told me something else the investigator had uncovered. Sterling's work history included pharmaceutical logistics and documented access to facilities where cardiac glycosides were handled and stored. By itself, that meant nothing. Plenty of people have access to things they never misuse. But Kendall had become increasingly concerned after learning about the affair, the deception surrounding Caleb, and the financial consequences Tiana faced if the truth ever surfaced. Kendall had a minor cardiac irregularity. He had known about it for 2 years. He looked at me and said, "If something happens to me unexpectedly, tell them not to stop with a standard toxicology screen. Tell them to look deeper. Tell them to consider cardiac glycosides." He did not say he knew what would happen. He said he wanted the possibility examined. He said it the way he explained everything, calm, precise, thorough, like a man closing a system before he stepped away from it. Then he talked about Caleb. That was the only moment that night his composure broke. He had loved that child for 4 years, completely, without reservation. I watched my son grieve something that was still alive and sitting in the next room, and I had no words for what that cost him. I still don't. 6 weeks after that conversation, Kendall was dead. The death certificate said cardiac event. I called his attorney the next morning and said 4 words. Test for glycoside toxicity. He said, "Kendall told me you would say that." I said, "Then you know what to do next." The most dangerous kind of conversation is the one where every word means something other than what it says. Where the surface is warm and the current underneath is cold, and the other person is counting on you not to feel the difference. Tiana called me 3 days before the estate meeting. She opened with my well-being. Had I been eating? Was I sleeping? Was anyone checking on me? Her voice carried that specific softness she deployed when she needed something to feel maternal. I told her I was managing, that some days were harder than others, that I appreciated her thinking of me. Every word I gave her was true, and none of it was useful to her. We talked about Kendall for a few minutes. Small memories, safe ones. She laughed softly at something, and I laughed with her, and neither of us was fully present in the conversation we were pretending to have. Then she shifted. It was gradual, the way weather changes before you consciously register it. She said she had been thinking about the meeting, that she hoped it would be straightforward, that the last thing she wanted was for this process to feel adversarial between 2 people who had loved the same man. She said she believed Kendall would have wanted them to take care of each other. I told her I felt exactly the same way. Then she said her legal team had advised her that these proceedings could get complicated if both sides weren't cooperative. That contested estate matters sometimes dragged on for years. That the uncertainty, the financial uncertainty specifically, wouldn't be healthy for Caleb growing up. She said it with concern in her voice. She said Caleb's name the way she always said it, like a shield she had learned to hold in front of herself at the precise moment she needed cover. I listened to every word without changing my tone by a single degree. I told her I understood completely, that I wanted this resolved cleanly too, that Caleb's well-being mattered to me more than any legal process ever could. I heard her exhale, small, almost imperceptible. And I understood that the exhale was relief. She thought she had gotten something from me. A reed, a softness she could use. I had given her nothing. After the call, I sat in my kitchen and replayed it from the beginning. Tiana was not calling to reassure me. She was calling because something about the estate process had unsettled her, and she could not identify what. She had done everything right. The filing, the documentation, the paper trail she built across years. Everything was in order. But something felt unresolved to her, and she had called me to find out if I was the thing she should be worried about. I thought about what Kendall told me the night he sat at my table. He said, "She's smart, Mama, but she only knows how to play offense. She's never had to play defense a day in her life." She was playing defense now, and she didn't even know that's what it was. The next morning, a card arrived in my mailbox. Handwritten. Tiana's penmanship. Careful, deliberate. The kind of handwriting that takes effort to produce. She thanked me for always being a loving mother-in-law. Said it had meant more than I knew. Said Kendall had been lucky to have me. I opened the card and read the inside. "We're going to be fine. Both of us." I held it for a long moment. Then I walked to the drawer where I had placed nothing of consequence, and I laid it inside and closed it. It was evidence of nothing criminal, nothing actionable. Just a woman writing to an audience she believed was still watching her performance. She had no idea the theater was already empty. When someone believes they have already won, patience becomes the first thing they lose. The confidence that felt like strategy starts showing its edges. The moves get faster. The tone gets harder. The carefully constructed performance begins to develop small, telling cracks. I watched it happen in real time through legal correspondence. The filings started arriving in sequence. Motion to expedite the estate process. Request for early access to Vantage Shield's financial records. Correspondence to my attorney that escalated in tone with each exchange. The language shifted from formal to pressing, to something that read less like legal procedure and more like a woman running toward a finish line she could not yet see clearly. My attorney called me after each one. He walked me through every filing with the careful patience of someone managing a client he was not entirely certain about. After the third call, he asked me directly whether I was sure I wanted to hold every line, that the expedite motion alone could create procedural complications if we didn't engage with it thoughtfully. I told him to hold everything. He asked me again. I told him again. What I did not tell him was why I was certain. That certainty had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with knowing what was sealed in a letter in his colleague's office across town. Every motion Tiana filed was pressure applied against a door she did not know was already locked from the other side. Then, one filing stopped me cold. It was a motion arguing that the delay in resolving the estate was causing ongoing financial uncertainty for a dependent minor. They had put Caleb's name in it, his age, 6 years old, rendered in legal language as a child whose future was being destabilized by the very woman who should have been protecting it. I read his name in that document and felt it land somewhere I had no defense for. Not Tiana's name, not Sterling's name, Caleb's. 6 years old and being used as a sentence in a motion he would never read, in a fight he did not choose, over a father who was not his father, and a mother who had made him an instrument before he was old enough to be anything else. I sat with that for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Kendall's estate attorney. Not about the estate proceedings, but about the secondary sealed file. I asked him to read me Kendall's written instruction one more time. The exact conditions. The exact sequence. He read it to me slowly. Upon the formal scheduling of the estate meeting, the attorney was to contact the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department and inform them that a file relevant to a potential criminal matter was available upon their request. The call had already been made. The door was already open. I thanked him and hung up. As I sat there, I found myself thinking about Caleb again. Kendall could not control what investigators ultimately did with the information he left behind. He could not decide what would become part of a court record someday. But he had done everything he could to make sure the truth existed somewhere beyond rumor, beyond memory, beyond whatever story someone else might choose to tell. He had thought about all of it. The pressure Tiana was applying was not confidence. A confident woman waits. She pushes because something about this process has been unsettling her since the phone call she made to feel me out and got nothing back. She is trying to arrive before whatever she cannot name arrives first. 2 days before the meeting, I drove past the house Kendall bought. I did not stop. The lights were on. Her car was in the driveway. I looked at that house and thought about a Sunday evening, a quiet kitchen, a simple question about happiness, a decision made in the space of a night that cost my son everything. I drove home. I slept better than I had in months. There is a specific quality to a night when you know something is coming that cannot be undone. Time does not speed up. It does not slow down. It simply becomes very precise. Every minute, exactly the length it is supposed to be. Every ordinary thing sitting completely still inside its own outline. I made dinner. Nothing significant. Something simple. Something warm. I folded laundry at the kitchen table and put it away one pile at a time. I sat on my back porch for a while and listened to Charlotte settle into the evening around me. Distant traffic. A neighbor's television through a window. The particular quiet of a city that does not know or care what tomorrow holds for the woman sitting on the porch on this specific street. I was not rehearsing anything. I was not running scenarios. I was simply present, more present than I had been in months, since before Kendall got sick, since before the world rearranged itself into what it was now. I thought about my son, not with grief tonight. Tonight it was something closer to admiration. A 34-year-old man who stood in a hospital corridor and looked at a number on a wall, and instead of collapsing, went home and started building. Who hired an investigator and ordered a test and drafted a letter and sealed 2 files and attached binding legal conditions to his own estate, all while going to work every day, all while sitting at dinner across from the woman who was planning to use his death, all while being a father to a child he had already learned was not his. He did all of that, and he never broke in front of anyone except once, briefly, in my kitchen, when he talked about Caleb. That is the kind of man I raised. I do not say that with pride tonight. I say it with something that has no clean name, a love that has nowhere left to go, and so it just sits in your chest and takes up all the space. There is something I have never told anyone. In the weeks after Kendall died, the worst weeks, the ones where the silence in my house had actual weight, there were 3 days where I came very close to calling Tiana, not to confront her, not to accuse her, simply because the thing I was carrying was almost more than one person could hold, and she was the only other person in my life who was supposed to be carrying it with me. I wanted to believe for 3 days that she was what she had performed being. I didn't call. I went back to his note instead. 4 words. A date. I thought about the woman from the funeral, the one who stood near the back and left before anyone reached her. I had turned her over in my mind several times in the months since without arriving anywhere. I did not know her name. I did not know her connection to any of this. But I had wondered, in the quiet of nights like this one, whether she had come because she needed to see something, whether she was carrying something too. I filed her away again. Tomorrow had enough to hold. I went to bed before 9. In the dark, I talked to Kendall the way you talk to someone when there are no words adequate to what you need to say, without speaking, just sending it. I told him I would be in the room tomorrow. I told him I was not afraid. I told him I loved him in the specific way you love someone who is gone, and took a piece of your architecture with them. I slept. I woke at 5 in the morning with the room still dark. I lay there for a moment thinking about one word Tiana had used on the phone: cooperative. I got up. I made coffee. I stood in front of my closet and I chose black, not for mourning, not for performance. Because Kendall told me once, years before any of this, that I looked like someone who had already won when I wore it. I put it on. The conference room was on the 12th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, Charlotte spread out behind the glass like it had nothing better to do than bear witness. A long table, leather chairs, the kind of room where serious things get decided by people who have learned to keep their faces neutral while deciding them. I arrived first. I chose my seat deliberately, facing the door, back to the window, the light behind me. Kendall taught me that. He said always know where the light is coming from. Tiana arrived 8 minutes later with 2 men, her attorney and a second associate carrying a leather portfolio that he set down with the quiet confidence of someone who considered the outcome of this meeting a formality. She crossed the room and embraced me. Warm hands, the right pressure, her cheek briefly against mine. I returned it completely. We sat across the table from each other. Her attorney opened with a presentation that was organized and thorough. The filing's key arguments structured and sequenced, documentation referenced by exhibit number, language precise. He spoke for 14 minutes. Tiana sat beside him projecting composed grief, the widowed mother, the responsible guardian, the woman asking only for what her child deserved. Then she leaned forward. She looked directly at me for the first time since we sat down, and her voice dropped into something controlled and deliberate. She said she thought everyone in the room understood how this needed to go. That Kendall was gone, that Caleb was his son and his heir, that the right thing, the thing Kendall himself would have wanted, was to put the company in his son's name and let me step back and be taken care of. Her attorney put his hand flat on the table, a quiet signal to slow down. Tiana did not look away from me. I held her eyes and I said nothing. I smiled, not widely, not performed, just enough. I had needed those words spoken in this room, in front of these people, before what came next. She had just given them to me. My attorney had not moved. Now he opened the file in front of him and said he had been instructed by the late Kendall Wynne to read a document before any estate matters were discussed. Tiana's attorney objected immediately, procedurally, firmly, with the confidence of a man who believed the objection would hold. The estate attorney explained without raising his voice that this was not a scheduling preference. Kendall had attached a binding written condition governing the administration of the estate. The letter was to be read first. It was not subject to the discretion of anyone in the room. Tiana's attorney sat back. The letter was read aloud. Every word Kendall wrote, the fever, the blood type discrepancy discovered later in the medical records, the private laboratory, the hair sample, the 11 days, the DNA result, laboratory report number, chain of custody documentation, the result itself confirming that Kendall Wynne was not Caleb's biological father, attached as Exhibit A. Then the private investigator, the photographs, the name, Sterling Mack, spoken aloud in that room for the first time. Then the legal language. The DNA evidence directly contradicted the factual basis on which Tiana's claim had been presented. More importantly, Kendall's controlling interest in Vantage Shield had already been transferred into an irrevocable trust 14 months earlier, placing ownership beyond the reach of later estate claims and outside the authority of any beneficiary to redirect. Kendall had answered every argument before anyone made it. I watched Tiana's face while every word landed. The cold confidence didn't shatter. It drained. Slowly, completely, like water finding its level. The composure held on the surface, but something behind her eyes recalibrated in real time as she understood that the DNA result did not simply embarrass her. It removed the floor from everything she had built. When the letter finished, the room was absolutely quiet. Her attorney leaned over and began whispering. Tiana did not move. Then she looked up across the table and found my eyes. She said it quietly, almost to herself. He knew. I said nothing. I did not need to. A room that has just changed feels different from a room that has not. The air sits differently. People move differently, careful, recalibrated, like they are navigating a space whose dimensions have shifted without the walls visibly moving. Voices carry different weight. Even silence lands with more precision than it did an hour before. I felt it the moment the letter finished, and the estate attorney closed his file. The meeting concluded with the formal language these things require. Tiana's claim was denied. Geneva's trust held exactly as Kendall had structured it. Irrevocable, untouchable, established long before any of this had a legal name. Tiana's attorney requested 48 hours to review the documentation before any further proceedings. The request was granted. Everyone stood. Papers were gathered. The room began its careful dispersal. In the parking deck, Tiana walked past me without speaking. Not with coldness. Coldness would have been a choice, something performed. This was different. This was the particular quality of someone who has just watched the entire architecture of a plan collapse in a single room and has not yet located the place inside themselves where they go when that happens. She walked past me like I was part of the scenery, like she needed to get somewhere before she understood what had just occurred. I let her go. I drove home alone through Charlotte with the windows up and the radio off. I made tea in my kitchen, the same table where Kendall sat across from me and told me everything. And I allowed myself 5 minutes. Not crying exactly, not relief exactly. Something that lived between the two and belonged to neither completely. 5 minutes of being a mother whose son was still dead, and whose son had also just won something from beyond wherever he was. Both of those things, true, simultaneously, both of them mine to hold. Then I put my cup in the sink and picked up the phone. My attorney called that evening. His voice carried the careful tone of a man managing news he was not certain how to deliver. Tiana's legal team had already been in contact. They were discussing a challenge to the letter's validity, arguing it had been prepared under duress, that Kendall's state of mind at the time of drafting was compromised. They were not done. They were wounded, and they were recalibrating. I told him to let them file whatever they needed to file. He paused. Then he said he would hold the line. What neither he nor Tiana's team knew was that the civil proceeding was not the only thing moving. Weeks earlier, on the morning the estate meeting was formally scheduled, Kendall's estate attorney had made a phone call to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Exactly as Kendall's written instructions specified, he had informed them that his late client had deposited a sealed file relevant to a potential criminal matter and that it was available to investigators upon formal request or subpoena. Investigators had requested it within 24 hours of that call. By the morning of today's estate meeting, before Tiana walked into that conference room, before she leaned forward and said what she said, before the letter was read, law enforcement already had everything Kendall had left them. Not because I triggered anything, not because I made a call or filed a request. because Kendall had opened that door before he died and had simply told his attorney when to knock. The civil process and the criminal process had been moving simultaneously for weeks, neither waiting on the other, neither dependent on the outcome of the other. I thought about the specific intelligence of that, the thoroughness of it. A 34-year-old man making sure that even if the estate meeting went perfectly, the larger truth still had its own road to travel. My son was thorough. That night, my phone rang. A Charlotte area code I didn't recognize. I answered on the second ring. A man identified himself as a detective with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. He said he wanted to know if I had time to come in and speak with investigators at my earliest convenience. I told him, I have been waiting for this call. I meant it in more ways than one. Walking into a police precinct with information instead of injuries feels like carrying something the building was not designed to receive. Not a victim, not a suspect. Something the intake process has no standard form for. A woman who has been holding the map while everyone else was still looking for the territory. I signed in at the front desk. A detective met me in the lobby and walked me back through a corridor that smelled like recycled air and old coffee. The room he brought me to was plain: table, chairs, a mirror I did not look at longer than necessary. I sat down and folded my hands and waited. There were two of them. One spoke more than the other. I gave them everything in the order it happened: the hospital and the blood type, the private investigator and the restructuring timeline, the compound Kendall described and his cardiac irregularity, and the specific instruction he left about what to test for. I handed over the note from his desk drawer in a small evidence bag I had prepared before leaving my house. I told them about the phone call I overheard in my hallway 7 months before Kendall died. The low voice, the words, the certainty underneath them. I gave them everything in sequence, without editorializing, without emotion that would slow the information down. The detective who spoke most took notes with the focused efficiency of someone transcribing rather than processing, which told me the information was confirming something rather than building it from nothing. When I described what Kendall had told me about the compound and his cardiac irregularity, I watched the quality of the man's attention shift, not sharply, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking for it, just a slight adjustment. The way a person adjusts when a piece they already hold finds the place it belongs. I said, the toxicology came back. He said they were not able to discuss specifics of an active investigation. That was confirmation enough. Then he asked me directly whether I had any suspicion at the time of Kendall's death that it was not natural. I paused, not from uncertainty, but because the question deserved precision. I told him, I knew my son. I knew what he was building. And I knew that the woman who had the most to lose from what he was building was the woman sleeping beside him. That is not suspicion. That is arithmetic. The quieter detective wrote something down. I did not ask what. Before I left, the detective told me they were currently looking at 2 individuals in connection with Kendall's death. He gave no names. I did not ask for any. I sat for a moment with what he had said and let it settle. 2 people, both of whose names I already knew, both of whom had sat at tables I had sat at, both of whom I had extended the ordinary courtesies of someone who trusted that the world contained the people it appeared to contain. I thanked them and walked back out through the corridor and through the lobby and into the Charlotte afternoon. Driving home, I thought about Sterling Mack, not with the sharp heat of anger, with something colder and more clarifying than that. A man who had moved through my son's professional life like a colleague and moved through his personal life like a shadow, who had a background that gave him access to something precise and untraceable, who had used that access on a 34-year-old man who had shaken his hand. I thought about the woman at the funeral again. Not who she was. I had wondered about that long enough. I wondered now what she had known, and when she had known it. Whether what she carried to that funeral was grief or guilt, or something that had not yet found its name. I pulled into my driveway and picked up my phone before going inside. Tiana had posted again. A photograph of Caleb, his face, his small, serious expression, the particular way he held his chin that I recognized from somewhere that was not Kendall. The caption read, "His father's son." I stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then I put my phone away and went inside. Justice does not always arrive the way you built the room for it. Sometimes the last piece comes from a direction nobody planned, from someone who was never part of the architecture, who had no knowledge of the blueprint, who simply carried something to the right place at the right time because they had nowhere else left to put it. And sometimes you realize you saw that person before you knew what they were carrying. My attorney called on a Tuesday morning. His voice had a quality I had not heard from him before, not excitement, something steadier than that. He said investigators had contacted him. A woman had come forward. She had been in a relationship with the second individual under investigation and had provided information that gave law enforcement what they needed to move. I asked him the woman's name. He said, Pamela Grimes. I was quiet for a moment. The name meant nothing. And then the face attached itself to it. Unbidden and immediate. The woman at the back of the repast. Dressed appropriately, standing apart, watching everything without approaching anyone. Gone before I could cross the room. I said, I've seen her. My attorney asked what I meant. I said, she was at my son's funeral, standing in the back. She left before anyone could speak to her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that sounds about right. I sat with that after I hung up. Pamela Grimes had stood in the back of my son's funeral, carrying something she did not yet have the words for. Or perhaps carrying words she had not yet decided to use. She had come because she needed to see it. The reality of it. A man in a casket, whose death was connected to the man she trusted, and the woman she did not yet fully know had been running a version of this plan long before Pamela was ever in the picture. It was not heroism that made her call. I understood that clearly. It was the specific devastation of realizing that the person beside you was never fully yours. That you had been sleeping next to a lie that predated you. That a man was dead because of decisions made in rooms you were never invited into. That kind of realization does not produce heroism. It produces a phone call. And sometimes a phone call is the most consequential thing a person ever does. My attorney called back 2 hours later. The news of Pamela's cooperation had reached Tiana's legal team. The response had been immediate. Tiana understood at once that Sterling now had criminal exposure that could not be managed quietly, that Pamela's account had given investigators something they could move on, that the structure she had maintained for years had fully collapsed. Her civil challenges went silent. Her attorney stopped returning correspondence. Sterling was brought in within 48 hours. The combination against him was precise and complete. His pharmaceutical logistics background, his documented access to the compound, Pamela's direct account of conversations she had witnessed, and Kendall's sealed file, which had been in investigators' hands for weeks. Faced with all of it simultaneously, Sterling made the only calculation available to him. He cooperated. He gave investigators Tiana, the networking event, the plan, the pregnancy, the compound, the full timeline from the beginning, every detail, every conversation, everything. That evening, I sat in my house and thought about the geometry of what had just happened. Kendall's sealed file moving from one direction, Pamela's phone call moving from the other. 2 people who never met, carrying different pieces of the same truth toward the same point. her son, built one wall. A woman he never knew built the other. Between those two walls, there was no space left to stand. My attorney called at 9:40 that night. Tiana had been arrested. I listened to those words and felt them land in a place beneath strategy, beneath calculation, beneath every composed and careful thing I had been for months. Something deep and permanent and quiet. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my house in the dark, and I did not call anyone. There was no one to call. Every person I might have reached for was either gone or had never been who I thought they were. This moment belonged to me and Kendall alone. The truth spoken out loud by the person who has been hiding it does not arrive the way you imagined it would. You spend months, sometimes years, carrying the weight of what you know. And somewhere in that carrying, you construct an idea of what it will feel like when the other person finally says it. When they finally stop performing and simply tell the truth. It is never satisfying in the way you built it to be. It is always more devastating. Investigators contacted me through my attorney for a formal briefing. As a cooperative witness and Kendall's next of kin, I was entitled to a summary of the statement provided during proceedings. I went in on a Thursday morning. The detective who had spoken most during my first visit slid a document across the table and walked me through its contents with the measured tone of someone delivering information that he understood would land differently on me than it did on him. I took the summary home. I sat at my kitchen table and I read it the way I had read Tiana's legal filing months before. Not for the emotional impact first, but for the specific details. What she said. How she said it. What words she chose when no performance was required anymore. Tiana had given a full statement. She walked investigators through everything. The networking event, the plan she and Sterling had constructed, the pregnancy, Sterling's access to the compound, the timeline from beginning to end. She was not cooperating in any spirit of remorse. She was making a calculation, ensuring that Sterling's documented exposure was no smaller than hers. She was not going to carry more of this than the man who helped her build it. She gave them everything, and she gave it precisely. I read through it page by page. I was looking for one thing specifically. The moment she described Kendall. What word she used when she had no audience left to perform for, and the truth was the only remaining option. I found it near the middle of the document. She had described Kendall as a complication. I set the papers down. I sat with that word in the quiet of my kitchen, and I let it be exactly what it was. Not a husband, not a man, not even an obstacle, a complication, something that had disrupted a system, something that required a solution. My son, a complication. I picked the papers back up and kept reading. One section stopped me completely. Tiana had told investigators that in the final weeks before Kendall died, she believed he was close to filing, that whatever he was building was nearly ready. She said she was afraid of what the filing would contain. She said the decision was made because there was no other option available to them at that point. Then she said, it wasn't supposed to happen that way. It was only because Kendall found out. I read that twice. In Tiana's mind, there had always been a version of this story where Kendall never looked at that chart, where the blood type passed without notice, where he went home that evening unremarkable and unsuspecting, and the scheme continued its quiet course, and everyone took what they had come for without anyone dying. That version of the story had been the plan. The plan had required Kendall to be a man who did not read data the way he read data, who did not notice patterns the way he noticed patterns, who was not, at his core, the engineer his mother raised. His own intelligence had made him dangerous to them, and his own intelligence had cost him his life. I thought about 40 seconds in a hospital corridor, a number on a wall, a man standing still long enough to understand what he was looking at, and then going home and starting to build instead of falling apart. The same mind that got him killed was the same mind that made sure it did not end with him. I think he would have found something almost right about that. Not satisfying. Kendall was never satisfied with almost, but right. I folded the summary. I walked to the drawer where Tiana's handwritten card had been sitting since the morning it arrived. We're going to be fine, both of us. And I placed the confession summary inside with it. I closed the drawer. Then I went to the window. Charlotte in the late afternoon. The city indifferent and continuous, moving through itself without pause. I stood there and I thought about Caleb. 6 years old, somewhere in this city right now. Innocent of everything, carrying a name that is going to require explanation someday. Not today. Not for years, maybe. But the explanation is coming and it will cost him something I cannot calculate yet. That is not today's grief. But it is coming. There is a specific weight to walking into a building that belongs to you, fully, legally, finally. When the cost of arriving there is something you will carry for the rest of your life. It does not feel like victory. It feels like inheritance. Like receiving something that was always meant to be yours and understanding for the first time everything it passed through to get to your hands. I drove to the Vantage Shield offices on a Wednesday morning. I parked in the same deck Kendall used to park in. I rode the elevator to the 4th floor. The staff knew I was coming. I had called ahead, kept it quiet, told them I just wanted a few hours in the space. They were kind, in the careful way. People are kind when they understand that your presence somewhere means more than your presence somewhere. I walked into Kendall's office and I closed the door behind me. The room was as he left it. Nobody had disturbed the order of it. The files arranged by the logic only he could have explained. The system architecture documents in their labeled folders. The coffee mug I gave him the Christmas he launched the company still on the corner of the desk. And on the wall directly across from where he sat every day. The framed, founding paperwork. Both our names. His signature and mine beneath the language that said we had built this together and it belonged to us both. I sat in his chair. I thought about what this company had survived without anyone on the outside knowing it was surviving anything. The marriage that was constructed around accessing it. The scheme that ran parallel to its growth for years. The legal challenge that tried to dismantle it in a conference room 12, floors above Charlotte. The investigation that ran alongside all of it. Through every single piece of that, 7 corporate clients had renewed their contracts. The infrastructure Kendall designed had kept running. Quiet, invisible, exactly as he intended it to be. Exactly as he built it. He built it to last. He built everything to last. My attorney had called the day before with the administrative reality of what came next. Tiana's trial date was set. Sterling's sentencing remained pending the terms of his cooperation agreement. There would be court appearances, civil proceedings, the long, unglamorous work of justice moving through its actual pace rather than the pace you imagined for it. It was not over in the clean way. It was over in the real way, permanent and ongoing and requiring more from me before it required nothing. I had told him I understood. I did. There was something I had not told anyone. In the weeks between the estate meeting and the arrests, in that suspended period when the civil case had collapsed and the criminal case was still building, I received a text message from a number I did not recognize. It said only, "I'm sorry about your son. I didn't know." I looked at those words for a long time. Then I wrote back once, "I know you didn't." The number never contacted me again. I never confirmed whose it was. I have never needed to. Some things arrive with their own certainty. Not the certainty of proof, but the certainty of recognition. A woman who stood in the back of a funeral and left before anyone could reach her. A woman who made a phone call that cost her something real and then disappeared back into her own grief quietly, without credit, without asking for anything in return. Pamela Grimes did the right thing in the only way she knew how to do it. Alone and without acknowledgement, and in the direction of a truth that had nothing left to give her. I thought about Caleb. I do that every day now, not with resolution, because there is no resolution available yet, with patience. A long, specific patience for a 6-year-old boy in this city who is innocent of everything he was born into and will need someone to still be standing when the explanations become necessary. I do not know yet what my presence in his life looks like. I only know I am not going anywhere. I stood up from Kendall's desk. I walked to the window and put my hand flat against the glass. Charlotte spread out in the morning, indifferent, continuous, alive in the way cities are alive, with no awareness of the specific weight of what one woman was carrying on the 4th floor of one building on one Wednesday. I thought about a Sunday evening and a simple question about happiness. I thought about 4 words taped to the underside of a drawer. I thought about a number on a hospital wall and 40 seconds of a man standing still and understanding what he was looking at and going home and building instead of breaking. I thought about my son trusting me to be in the room. I was in the room. I am still in the room. Kendall, I was there. Every single thing you built, I was there.